Welcome everybody to our next session. I've got Chipp Norcross and Paul D. Roberts joining me today. We're going to be talking about how you can create business strategies that are resilient against these existential threats that we face today. As you probably have guessed, we've had a little bit of technical difficulty. This is going to be our first time that we're doing a dual presentation. Wi-Fi and all that kind of stuff is all over the place, but we are going to do our best to get through it. Let me quickly introduce these guys, and then we will get them up and running. So Chipp Chipp, wave for us. He is our Vice President of Family Programs, and perhaps more importantly during these times is also a father of two boys who are growing up in the heart of Silicon Valley and mostly indoors these days. He has an extensive background in innovation and strategy, previously ran SU's world-renowned executive program, and has been part of SU for almost 6 years. Before SU, Chipp worked in the fields of innovation, strategy, and new product development while at McKinsey and Synetics, and holds a Bachelor of Science in Computer Information Systems and Finance from Indiana University, and simultaneously earned both an MBA and a Master's of Science degree in engineering from Stanford. I didn't know that about you, Chipp.
There you go, you live and learn.
He's also an alumni of the December EP. Now, I don't know if Paul's to my left or right or below for you guys, but Paul D. Roberts is a faculty member here at Singularity University and a partner at the Be Courageous Innovation. He is an innovation design and facilitation professional with 20 years of experience in the fields of strategic innovation and creative change, economics, media, and entertainment. With SU and Be Courageous, Paul teaches design, facilitates and trains Fortune 500 organizations and their leadership teams to create innovative, strategic business solutions and to build agility into their organizations to create the type of change that drives growth. That's some of the stuff that they're going to be talking about today. So I will get out of the way and let you guys run the show.
Great. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Adam.
And yes, we are we're kind of learning in real time about being able to do a multi-location session. So if you see me reaching over here, it's because I've got multiple computers that are all trying to work at the same time. So anyway, thank you, everybody. Welcome. Thank you, Adam, very much for that gracious introduction. We're here to talk to you about strengthening your company's resilience against existential threats. And the context of this is we're not talking about what to do today, about the threat that we're in. We want to have a conversation about how to prepare for the next time something like this might happen, because there's no better time to prepare for the next existential threat that we might face than when we're in the middle of this one, because it gives us the most clarity of thought and perspective on how we might move forward in our preparations for the future. So our first piece of advice as we get into this conversation is very simply, during this time, keep a diary. Remember this journey that we're on, because our minds have this very interesting way of being able to smooth out the past and help us forget the really bad times that we might have been through, or the times that we might have been really nervous or panicked about even what might have been happening around us. So our recommendation is keep a diary, whether it's a video diary or writing something every day about what you're going through, because it'll give you the courage on the other side of this to be able to make what might be counterintuitive decisions about how to strengthen your business for the next event that we might be facing in the future, whether it be pandemics or something else. And that could include the news you read, distractions, things that make you feel better, things that make you feel worse, and even the conversations and some of the meetings that you're having, and some of the decisions that you're deliberating upon right now, because those will all be things that will help you to make better decisions about how to prepare your organization for the future. So let's go ahead and get started. This conversation really started with a simple question that Paul and I were talking about last week. And it was the question of, why aren't more companies more prepared for the COVID-19 pandemic that we're facing right now? And that launched us into pulling together a lot of our best current thinking on a variety of different topics of strategy and innovation. And one of the things that I think was most profound in what we've been reading through and accumulating over the last few days was this quote from Roald Amundsen, the first person to reach the South Pole, which was, "Victory awaits him who has everything in order, luck people call it. Defeat is certain for him who has neglected to take the necessary precautions in time. This is called bad luck." And the reason that I think Paul and I both found this as a important framing for this conversation, and we found this in the book Great by Choice by Jim Collins, is because it really talks about preparation. And I think that is the preparation that we're doing now is the big theme. The preparation that you do for the next time this occurs is the big theme that we're going to focus on. So, many people know Singularity University from the work that we've done on global grand challenges, the working with startups, working with investors, working with governments and NGOs to be able to solve the global grand challenges that we face around the world. But there's another side to global grand challenges, and that is the existential risk that they pose to business and to society. And just over the last few months and few years, we've seen terrorist attacks. We've seen hacks into sensitive databases and our own personal information. We've seen water shortages in places like Cape Town and Sao Paulo. We've seen incredible fires in Australia and California. That has all led to disaster resilience requirements for us to be able to think better about how we strengthen our infrastructure for the future. And we're facing a time right now where this health pandemic is putting at risk our prosperity across many parts of society. And the question that we started to think a lot about was, why didn't we see this coming? And that led us to take a look back at where we've been over the last few months. The first COVID-19 case was detected 4 months ago, back on November 17th in China. At that time, it looked like a mysterious pneumonia. We weren't quite sure what was happening, but by the time we got to the end of December, the Chinese health authorities first reported it to the World Health Organization on December 31st. So that's about 2.5 months ago, since the time that it became a big enough issue that it was reported to the World Health Organization. As time went on, we started to see these videos of an empty Wuhan, China that started to circulate around the world, and thought, wow, I remember people in our conversation circles saying that's incredible, but it seemed like it was isolated. That could never happen in a place like San Francisco, of course. The World Health Organization, though, about that time declared a global health emergency on January 30th. And only a couple of weeks later, the S&P 500, which we've been tracking along here on the bottom, is now at a global all-time high. And that's 3 months after the first case was found. In that 3 months, our stock markets, our economic indicators continued to move forward until all of a sudden the market crashed. And now I keep updating this slide, but we are in a global market crash that is, we're looking at all kinds of different economic stimulus to be able to try and pull ourselves out of. But in reality, we've had 3 months. We had 3 months between the middle of November to the middle of February to be able to prepare for this. And obviously our early warning systems weren't working. But our early warning systems even go back further to almost 5 years ago when Bill Gates and many other experts around the world have been sounding the alarm bell.
Sorry to interrupt real quick. We've got a problem. We can't see the slide because Paul, I believe you've got the bar up that shows the slide number and a bunch of stuff.
Thank you.
And possibly try maybe just using your arrow keys to advance it instead of the clicker or the mouse. Sorry.
Thank you.
Perfect. Cool. Is that better, audience? Oh, it's back. I think it's going to come up anytime you move your mouse. Okay, it's gone now. I think we're good, Paul.
It is gone, but I can't advance it.
Oh, the arrows don't work either?
No, they don't.
Okay, well then maybe when you just advance it, whatever you just did worked great.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Sorry for interrupting, guys. Keep on going.
That's okay. All right, so I'll go on. So what's happened, I guess, is really the question. Why is it that 5 years ago, Bill Gates stood on a stage and told us about the coming pandemics, and we haven't done anything about it? So what we really, as we dug into this question, we found 3 primary reasons that companies really aren't prepared for the COVID outbreak that we're facing. One is just a misunderstanding of the probability of rare events and our limitations for being able to measure it. 2 is our pursuit of efficiency in good times that leads to fragility in our companies in bad times. And 3 is excessive financial engineering, which has led to weak balance sheets. And that's through a number of things like being over leveraged, pursuing stock buybacks, and just having relatively small balances of cash on hand as organizations. And we want to examine all three of these. So first is our misunderstanding of the probability of a rare event and our limitations for being able to measure it. So the first question here is the paradox of a 100-year flood. This is a picture of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And we hear a lot in insurance and disaster recovery industries about the idea of a 100-year flood, which is a flood that has a 1% chance, 1% probability, I should say, of happening in any given year, using a probabilistic model that is used for such calculations. So question, and Paul, I'm going to look at you here for this. If a 100-year flood happens this year, what is the probability of one happening next year?
1%?
Correct, yeah, 1%. Pretty straightforward. Now the question then is, if one happens this year, and that was a 1% chance of one happening this year, what's the probability of a 100-year flood happening again next year?
1%.
Yeah, and that's one of the places where people really get hung up on this, because there's often a feeling that something happens now, great, now we've got 50 or 100 more years until we might be able to face the next 100-year flood. But as we start to look out over longer periods of time, which many of us are thinking about from our strategy standpoints, the question becomes one of, what's the probability of a 100-year flood happening maybe in the next 10 years? And now it's not 1%, it's almost 10%. And we start to find ourselves exposing ourselves to risk a lot more than we might be considering that we are. You can take this model and apply it directly towards pandemics that we're in as well. If you take that exact same model, the textbook disease control priorities has estimated that any given year, there's a 1% probability of an influenza pandemic that could cause 6 million pneumonia and influenza deaths or more globally. So, what's the problem of an influenza pandemic happening next year, even though we're in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis? It's 1%. What's the probability of an influenza pandemic happening in the next 10 years? Almost 10%, 9.56%. And what's perhaps the more difficult question? What's the probability that an influenza pandemic won't happen next year? And the answer to that is 99%. And I think this is where we start to trip ourselves up, because it seems like such a strong likelihood that it won't happen in the future that we stop preparing for it. Thinking about risk this way leads to several problems. It assumes that we can accurately compute the probability of rare events, which we can't. It can mislead people and create a false sense of safety. In New Orleans, they had levees when Hurricane Katrina came through that were built to withstand a 10-year flood, which is just by definition not the worst case scenario. And it also limits our imagination to think about what could be an even bigger disaster that we need to prepare for. The idea of thinking about 100-year floods, well, we don't think about 200-year floods. We don't think about 500-year floods. We have to think bigger about the possibilities of downside risk that we might be facing. And that came out during the global financial crisis, when Alan Greenspan, in retrospect, said that there was really a lack of imagination about what could happen, what could go wrong in the global financial markets. As he was quoted as saying, this was not supposed to happen. It was the worst financial crisis in history. It had never happened before. It will not happen for another 50 years, but it will happen again. And even in that statement, there's a lot of assumptions about, was this really a 50-year crash, or was it something that might happen more frequently, or even be more built into the system that we have? A lot of people have started to talk about these events as black swans. Those are large-scale, unpredictable, and irregular events of massive consequence. The book by Nassim Taleb had brought this really into everyone's awareness a little over a decade ago. And then a follow-up book that he wrote called Anti-Fragile is one which I think is perhaps even more important. And that's the idea that because black swans are unpredictable, we know that something will happen. We just don't know what or when. Perhaps the best defense that we have against them is this idea of anti-fragility, which is something that we're going to talk a little bit more about. And if you go back and look over the last 70 years, there's been 6 major black swan events that the stock market has faced, the S&P 500 in this case, as well as 8 minor black swans. And you start to get the feeling that these are happening all the time. And the idea that we're operating in a stable environment is one that is a bit of a fantasy for us. So let's move on to the second piece here. The pursuit of efficiency in good times leads to fragility in bad times. As I mentioned before in the book Anti-Fragile, it's suggested that perhaps the best antidote to the black swan may be anti-fragility. So a fragile system, that is something that is very much like a human-made system, a machine in this case. It's something that is centralized. It's weakens under stress. There aren't frequently mistakes, but when there are mistakes, they're really large. It can be damaged by uncertainty and volatility. It can break. There aren't any interdependencies. It's machine-like. If I push a button here, I can tell what's going to happen over there. It's not dependent on other machines or what the weather might be necessarily that day in a different part of the world. And as we're going to talk about later on today, when we have our friend Catherine Brown in a later session, there's this idea of being complicated. That's this machine perspective, that it might be difficult to be able to understand, but it's complicated, versus anti-fragile, which is complex. Something that's decentralized bottom up. Mistakes are frequent and small. It becomes stronger when stressed. It can thrive in uncertainty and volatility. It embraces randomness, evolves. There's extensive interdependencies between everything that's happening in an ecosystem. And this really important term of causal opacity. We don't necessarily know what will happen if we push the button over here, or what might have caused an ultimate effect to happen. And now I would say that we're living in a world that is perhaps much more anti-fragile, but we seem to be treating it as if it's fragile and it's something that we can calculate. So I want to go through a quick quiz. And it's a simple question about how can you test for fragility versus anti-fragility? And the simple test is there more upside than downside from random events? If the answer is yes, then it's fragile. If the answer is no, then it's if it's yes, it's anti-fragile. If the answer is no, it's fragile. And Paul, I know we're kind of back and forth on audio here, but I want to see if I can bring you back into this so we can go through this session together. So the first question about fragility is that of a porcelain teacup. So if you're there, fragile or anti-fragile?
Fragile.
Yeah. So you knock it off the side of your desk, it's going to break on the ground. The next one, autonomous driving software, fragile or anti-fragile?
Well, the first time you asked me this, I said fragile, but then I started to think about it a little more, and there's an anti-fragility built into the system, because when one car makes a mistake, all the other cars learn from it.
Yep, I would completely agree with you on that.
Yeah.
The global economy, fragile or anti-fragile?
It's mixed. Some of it is, some of it isn't, right? You know, some of it is, as we're seeing, is quite fragile, although we don't have how will it learn yet, lesson from it. But and other parts of it are anti-fragile. They're managing to sort of have alternatives built into them, and the system can move around. So it's not quite as machine-like. It's mixed. Yep.
And I think if you go back and look at that S&P 500 over the 70 years, you see that despite the different interruptions, it continued to move up and to the right. And then this last one, which is really the topic that we've been talking about over the last week, is an individual company, fragile or anti-fragile.
And that's I think, dependent on every company. It's fascinating when you look at this list, because the first thing you think about this list is that it is embedded within another system. When we ask about an individual company, we're starting to say, how does our company operate? How linear is it? How rigid is it? How much like an ecosystem is it internally? How decentralized is our decision making? How able are we to evolve? And so it's really depends on the company itself.
So I think you're spot on with that. And if we think about this next question, is fragility being engineered into our companies? I just want to give a quick example of where I think it is. And it starts with a story of a gene company. And this is a real story. It's something that a friend of mine who was working in financial accounting about 20 years ago shared with me. And it was a story of a gene company that was based in the United States, and they were sending their denim from Los Angeles to California to have a zipper sewn into it. And then they were being sent back to the United States for sale. So the company would have the jeans, they'd put them on a ship. It would take around 12 days to get from Los Angeles to China. At that point, they'd be offloaded. They would be paired up with a zipper. They'd be sewn together, so you'd get an end product of a jean that was ready for sale. Then it would be put back on a ship, and sent back across the ocean for another 12 days to Los Angeles, where eventually it would be distributed out to store shelves around the country. And all of that was done to save, a few cents per pair of jeans. And I look into this, I remember having the conversation at the time that it makes accounting sense perhaps, but doesn't make common sense. And I think that was really the dilemma that at the time we didn't have language like fragility and anti-fragility. But as I look at this is to me, a very fragile system, because it's one that has all of those components of being, there are infrequent mistakes, but when there are mistakes, they're large. There's a lot of opportunity for breakage. It's machine-like. That's the way that it's been designed. When in reality, there's a lot of randomness that occurs, whether it be storms or longshoreman strikes or trade tariff wars or whatever it might be that could get in the way. And I think that this is an example to me of a place where we've really engineered fragility into our system at the pursuit of efficiency. And that's a question about whether that's the right thing to be doing. Paul and I share a passion around strategy. One of our favorite strategy authors, Roger L. Martin, who wrote the great book Playing to Win, along with A.G. Lafley, wrote this article in Harvard Business Review about rethinking efficiency. And as we looked through it, this real perspective started to emerge that could the next source of competitive advantage really be anti-fragility instead of efficiency? And I highly suggest reading through this article. The idea behind it is that resilient systems that are resilient to the kinds of shocks that we're seeing across the economy today, are typically characterized by the very features that efficiency seeks to destroy, like slack in the system, or like redundancy or diversity. So that'll take us on to our third point here about why companies may not be prepared for this kind of a pandemic. And that's really about this question of financial engineering that's really led to weak balance sheets. And what that means for those of you that might not be in finance, it just means not having enough cash on hand to be able to survive this kind of a pandemic. If you read the news today, there's a lot in our current headlines about a focus on corporate balance sheet. There's talk of zombie companies that do not have enough cash on hand to be able to pay down their debt, and that might put them under a lot of pressure, and they might disappear. And one of the most illuminating things, I think, as we consider this idea of having cash on hand, is this question about, in order to be anti-fragile and build that as a competitive advantage, might it require us to become inefficient by traditional standards? And Jim Collins, who we've mentioned a couple of times here in this book, Great by Choice, really examined with this question of why do some companies thrive in uncertainty, even chaos, and others do not. And in the research, what they found were companies that outperformed their industries by at least 10 times and outperformed their nearest competitors. And the reasons that they did as they went through this research, what their conclusions were, it was about being disciplined, being empirical in their evidence, but also about being productively paranoid. And I think in this kind of a situation might be the most important piece for us. As it's the quote down here, financial theory says that leaders who hoard cash in their companies are irresponsible in the deployment of capital, but that's assuming a stable, predictable, and safe world. And what we're seeing is that world is not stable, predictable, and safe right now. Jim Collins says it never will be. I think that might be a question for a longer discussion as we think about what our mission is as at Singularity University in the world of creating a better world and using technology and everything to make to improve the state of the world going forward. But for right now, if we assume that the world that we're in is not stable, predictable, or safe, I think these assumptions that Jim Collins has hold. And his finding, one of the findings that they had was that companies that outperform their industries by 10x had cash to asset ratios of at least 3 to 10 times the companies that they were, an analysis of 87,000 other companies by the Journal of Financial Economics. And perhaps more importantly, they had more cash to assets on hand than their closest competitors more than 80% of the time. And as Paul and I, we've talked about, like, what does this mean? And I think that it's really easy to think this means a life preserver, that we've got cash as a life preserver. I don't think that's the right way to think about cash in this kind of a situation. It's also really easy to think about it as something that's just redundant, like you have two lungs, you might only need one lung to be able to survive. There's redundancy built into nature. That's certainly one of Taleb's perspectives, is build redundancy. And I don't also think that that's quite the right way to think about this. Yeah, I think about it much more of this idea of investment capital and downturn investment capital, because it's the companies that have higher cash reserves that are able to continue executing their plans and to be able to continue executing their strategy during downturns when all of their competitors might be pulling back. It's this idea that what you do before the storm comes that allows you to pull ahead. So not to mean that you profit and thrive because of the uncertainty or the shock that comes. It means that you continue to profit and thrive despite that. As a quote here from Jim, when a calamitous event clobbers an industry or the overall economy, companies fall into one of three categories: those that pull ahead, those that fall behind, and those that die. And the fact that a disruption occurs does not determine which one of those that you fall into. It's what you've done to prepare in advance that leads to that. And what you can see over here on this graph on the right from the book is how the 10x companies, these at 10 times outperform their industries. What happened to the market basket of those companies compared to their closest competitors? And when I look at this, part of why we wanted to bring this model in is because we know that Jim Collins does such thorough research into the studies that he has behind his books. And we feel like this is the kind of insight that is going to be really important for us to be able to change perhaps our perspective of how we manage cash and how we think about buffers, is not just being safe and perhaps being over safe, but actually being very determined about our downturn investment capital that we have to be able to help us persevere through our next shock that we might see, or our next disruption. So that leads us to the question of what should I do next? And I think the headline here, and we're going to turn it over to Paul to help lead us through this session, is we started off with the idea that the three of the biggest challenges we're seeing is a misunderstanding of the probability of rare events, the pursuit of efficiency that leads to fragility, and excessive financial engineering that leads to weak balance sheets. And we want to posit that the important thing to do in a time like this is to shift our mindset to one of preparing for perpetual instability. One of pursuing anti-fragility perhaps as a competitive advantage, and one of building a reserve of buffers and downturn advantage capital. And perhaps adding in this fourth piece, which is viewing global challenges that we saw at the very beginning of this conversation, like the ones we see around disaster resilience and pandemics and prosperity, not as being exogenous, but being endogenous to the system, being part of the system. And that's a place that Paul is really going to take us through.
Yeah. Thanks, Chip. So when we take a look at this, we'll start at this idea of embracing a mindset of preparing for perpetual instability. We're at SU, we take a look at this a lot. And this is Paul Sappho. He is our chair of future studies. And I love this quote from Paul because I think it really sums up the thing that we're trying to deal with here. Human nature is hardwired to abhor uncertainty. We're fascinated by change. But in our effort to avoid uncertainty, we either dismiss outliers entirely, which we've seen happening here. I mean, Chip did mention the fact that Bill Gates 5 years ago was warning us about this. We either dismiss these outliers entirely, or we attempt to turn them into certainties that they're not. So we're working in a world that is extremely ambiguous. And so in a world that is that ambiguous, one of the things that we need to be able to do is to say, how do we explore the future? If we're wanting to understand an unknown future, we've got to take techniques that say, get people together and start to explore. This is something that we do at Singularity University a lot. And if you've ever been to one of our sessions, you've seen this. We call this a disruption map or a futures wheel. It's an implications map. And you're starting to see those implications at the moment here globally with COVID-19. You're seeing this social distancing, which is leading to increased office work. It's homeschooling. And there's long-term applications to that where people get used to living at home. As they start to get used to living at home, will the workforce actually disperse? How will that affect real estate prices? You're seeing downturns in the economy, which may lead to a recession, which may lead to economic inequality. Will that fast track the move towards universal basic income? All of these things are, they're all knowable, right? As we said on the last slide, what we're looking for is, we hear the term unknown unknowns all the time. That's the famous one that Donald Rumsfeld brought forward. But in reality, these are knowable unknowns. If we start to explore, we've got COVID-19 in the middle of here, but you could just as easily put global pandemic, and the picture would look exactly the same. And if you had done this time last year, you could have seen all of this map and said, well, that's a really significant outcome that we would like to avoid. And if you then do things like painting a very vivid picture of what that could look like, it starts to bring into the conversation at the organization what might be out there that we're turning a blind eye to. This is the picture on the left is Mayor Garcetti here of Los Angeles. I live in Los Angeles. This is him announcing sort of the beginning of the shutdown of the restaurants, the shutdown of bars, the shutdown of public libraries. The video on the right with the man holding his hand out like this, if you may have seen this, I don't know, but you'll get this link. This is a video that was produced by the Future of Life Institute, led by Max Tegmark. And this video is a possible future. It is a future where we have killer drones. So drones that can be deployed, that have an explosive in it, and these explosives can take out what they call bad guys. It's a very evocative video. I encourage you to go and take a look at it. And the point of that video was created for the United Nations, was about to have a debate on new rules for autonomous weapons. And the idea is, let's really clearly paint a picture of the futures as we see it, start to understand the worlds that we want to live into and the worlds that we don't want to live into, and then start to make the decisions today about how we can avoid the worlds that we don't want to live into and start to live into the worlds that we do want to live into. And in an organization, we need to develop a culture, embrace a mindset of preparing for this perpetual instability by saying, let's explore these impacts, let's run these disruption maps, let's see things that we maybe would turn a blind eye to. What's the new technologies out there? What's the new business models? What are some of the infrastructures? What are some of these global grand challenges? What would happen if this came to fruition? Let's start to uncover those knowable unknowns and then ask ourselves that question, how does this change the way we're currently preparing for the future? We develop a habit and ideally an agenda for a diverse group of internal and external people to come together and have open dialogues around these possible risks. The risks to your future narrative. You have a narrative. You may not have currently articulated what you think the future of your company would be in a narrative sense, but come together, develop a culture that doesn't punish people who say, listen, I see that narrative, but I also see this happening and this happening and this happening. You'll want to assign probabilities to that, and that can be helpful if you use those probabilities as sort of guides. There's a book just coming out that I've seen parts of, and I recommend exploring it further. It's called Radical Uncertainty, and there's some of this in that. So the idea is, this is an ongoing discussion. Let's just keep discussing what we're starting to see. Because remember, the world is going to stay unstable. There's things going to pop up all the time, and we need to get a sense of what they are, get people around the table and say, I'm starting to see this, and this could be a potential threat to us. So maybe we need to increase our reserves. Maybe we need to develop our system in a different anti-fragile way. Maybe we really want to look at that single supply chain coming out of China, or that single supply chain coming out of the United States. And we need to build more buffers into our system, because this is what I'm seeing. And this is a dialogue rather than a mathematical calculation. It's a dialogue that helps guide that mathematical calculation of how many reserves to hold in the end. And it's an ongoing dialogue. At the end of the day, it's keep calm and plan ahead. When I was younger, my mother, when I was a boy, my mother gave me a plaque, and it says, it wasn't raining when Noah built the ark, plan ahead. That's, I think, incredibly good advice, and that's where we're going in this space. So as we move from starting to paint pictures of the future and build that into our thinking, we then start to move towards saying, okay, given that world, how do we pursue anti-fragility as a competitive advantage? And Chipp, I'll pass back to you for that.
I think this is a decision for companies to think about. Is anti-fragility a competitive advantage in their industry? And what we would suggest is, on the journey to determining that, take 3 steps. One is, first of all, look at this model of anti-fragile, the qualities of an anti-fragile system, and just like become familiar with that. And really, first of all, examine your organizations from the standpoint of, are we fragile or anti-fragile, maybe as a whole, but also in different specific parts of your organization, whether it's be how you make decisions, or your operations, what your supply chains might look like, what your management structure might look like, what your cash on hand and your different ratios might look like as well. But use the time now, much in the same way that we suggested at the very beginning of this, having a personal diary. Have a diary of what you're seeing throughout this entire process, and where you're also experiencing fragility on a day-to-day basis, where there might be bright spots where anti-fragility might already exist in your organization, and where might it be lurking that it just hasn't become uncovered yet, but that it might be out there, and if things continue for a month or a couple of months, it might become more apparent. Maybe there's an opportunity to immediately think about how to make that more anti-fragile before it becomes an issue. And then really think through researching, modeling, testing this argument of efficiency versus anti-fragility. We're going to talk a little bit later with our friend Catherine Brown about the idea of polarities. And I think that anti-fragile versus efficient is going to be a really good homework assignment for many of you who are leading organizations to consider as a polarity homework assignment for you to do afterwards. But really look at the opportunities also where maybe being efficient can make you anti-fragile. It's not a trade-off necessarily, and it's something to really deeply understand and think about as you plan on moving forward as an organization. And then
can I just build on that for a second, Chipp?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, and our recommendation is look at the organizations that are surviving and why they did. We were talking about Haier, the company, the Chinese company, manufacturer of household goods. And a lot of the way that they have structured their organization fits this anti-fragile model. And as we go into the future and we come out of this, we'll be able to see if that really is working for them. Another great example that Andre Wegner, who is our chair of digital manufacturing, gives is when he looks at the Fukushima disaster and how that affected Toyota and their linear supply chain and how they were fragile, and then compares that to Lian Fong out of Hong Kong and how their decentralized, multi-networked system managed to make them thrive. So there can be some great lessons to learn as we come out of this as well. Thanks, Chipp.
And this third piece here about building a reserve of buffers and downturn investment capital. That seems really straightforward, just have more cash. But the reality is that it's not that simple, because we're dealing with in many cases an investment community or individual investors that might not see things the same way. So I think this is much more of a complex journey to walk on with your investors, with your board, with other people that might be stakeholders in your organization. And some specific recommendations on how to get down that path is, one, replace this idea of a 5-year plan with something that is that's just based on blue sky optimistic assumptions, with something that looks much more like a reality-based model. And it should be really rigorous and built on the idea of being able to persevere through downturns. And our executive chairman, Eric Anderson, is really a leader in this perspective of thinking about how to build these models as a communication tool between the corporate leadership and the investment community. And I think that looking at what he calls model thinking as a way to really shift the conversation from just management of your ratios and your quarter-to-quarter performance to something that is much more about long-term value creation is a real place to for us all to think a lot more deeply as we consider how we're going to be running our businesses and how we're going to be thinking about how investing and the investment community and working together in a different way going forward. And lastly, I would say, identify and agree upon new metrics and targets that really can help you to build measurement tools for your anti-fragility for future shocks that might come this way, so that you're measuring towards that, whether it's in addition to efficiency measures, how you come to land on that, but ensure that you're looking at both of them. And it's not just how are we running this company as efficient as possible, because that is going to expose us to much more risk potentially for future shocks. Paul,
Hey guys,
anything you want to add in on that?
Just a quick time check. We got about 4 minutes left.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Adam.
So this is to the last point that we were talking about. We look at these global grand challenges, which this pandemic is one of them, and we think of them as exogenous systems. We think of them as happening to us, right? But in reality, they're endogenous. They are part of the system itself. When we look at this specific pandemic, this is not the first time, unlikely that this is the first time that we've had a virus that shifts into humans. It's because of the way we've set up our systems and the way that we've set up our lives that this has become a pandemic. Similarly, with all of these things, environmental causes, with good governments and bad governments, with disaster resilience, it's with the water shortages, these are all endogenous in the system. So we can look at this concept of being at cause, which means we are affecting it, and at effect, which means that it is affecting us. Think of it this way. How many times have people said to themselves, why does this keep happening to me? As opposed to asking the question, what am I doing or not doing to cause this? And if we start to move into an at cause mindset, then we start to look at the world differently. We start to say that if I'm an airline, then preventing a pandemic is part of my risk assessment, part of my risk policies. So maybe I should invest in something like the Global Microbial Identifier, which is a group that met in Singapore earlier this year that is putting full genomes of food-borne illnesses and other microorganisms into a massive database, so you can react quicker to all of these potential pandemics. That's very much in the interest of the airlines. And so what we're suggesting is that as an organization, you start to be at cause with these global grand challenges. Be at cause in solving these global grand challenges. Explore, understand, and accept these global grand challenges are part of the system. They're endogenous, that they are solvable, that by solving them it's a risk management tool. It's not just a corporate social responsibility program. Look at the GGCs that can impact you the most. Ask yourself, how can we fund research in this? How can we invest in the startup fields in this? How can we build industry and cost industry groups targeting these GGCs? How can we push and support legislation that solves these GGCs? Let's be part of that solution. Be at cause and not at effect. And that's one of the big messages, because these are going to keep coming. The global grand challenges are going to keep coming. One of the places that we started was we said, keep a diary. Chipp went through, keep a diary. Tell yourself how this feels, what is happening as you go through. When we put this slide together, one of the things that we put forward and hid in here is this one. This has happened within the last 3 months. JP Morgan's economists warn of a catastrophic climate change. So there's something else coming. And we all know that climate change is endogenous to the system. So as we move forward and we look at risk management, I encourage you and invite you to be part of the solving of global grand challenges to help those uncertainties become less and less likely as we go forward. Chipp, would you like to say something?
Adam, thank you for having us, and Paul, thank you. It's been great to be able to work on this with you.
Likewise, Chipp. Thank you very much. Adam, is there a minute left, or how do we go?
I got to go swap to the next session. So we have come up on time, but I'll tell you what, we have some really great questions. Looks like we've got about 15 of them right now, and more will probably come in. So what I'd love to do is I'll have my team follow up with you guys. Let's figure out some ones that you can either make another video on, or just get some text out, and then we'll, excuse me, include that on the resources page moving forward. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Awesome.
Thank you, Chip. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks, everybody, for watching.
Be safe.
All right. Thanks, guys. Okay, everybody, we are going to keep going. We've got a couple more presentations left in our virtual summit. Thanks, everybody who, either if you're just tuning in or you've been sticking around, either way, thanks for being here. I'm going to go get the session ready with James Dell. We're going to talk about media. We've got some helpful resources there over on in the chat that the team just posted. So feel free to poke around in those. I know lots of you were asking for the slides. We will do our best to get those packaged up and on our website at su.org/COVID-19. And we'll make sure that those are available to you. So we are going to head into the next session. And actually, hey, oh, you just did it. Right on, Q team. We'd love to know what other topics you want to hear about from us next. So go to that poll. It's su.org/, I'm not going to read it all. It's right there in the chat. We'd love for you to upvote the ones that you'd love to hear more about, submit new ones. We plan on doing more and more of these events frankly, as often as we can. So you tell us what content you want to hear about. We will make it happen. Thanks for being here. I'll see y'all in a few minutes.